So we've basically been told this very specific, very persuasive story about our own minds.
Mm-mm.
We've been told that when we feel overwhelmed or, when we literally can't get out of bed or our hearts are just racing in the middle of a grocery store, it's because we have broken brains.
Right.
And millions of us, if you're listening to this, you've probably absorbed this narrative too. But the stack of sources we're doing a deep dive into today, we're talking clinical data, evolutionary biology, and some really heavy cultural critiques.
Mm-hmm.
They suggest something entirely different.
Yeah, they do.
In fact, it's something that is probably going to sound terrifying to the trillion-dollar industry built around this whole narrative. They are arguing that your brain isn't broken at all. It's actually doing exactly what it was designed to do.
It is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And we really need to set the stage carefully here because the sources we're drawing from today make some exceptionally strong claims.
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at papers on psychiatric morbidity, dialectical behavior therapy frameworks, and some really critical writings by the author Clive Spencer. And they essentially argue that what we casually call the mental health crisis is actually just a systemic misunderstanding of human biology.
Right.
Furthermore, they propose that the very phrase mental health has basically been weaponized by governments and pharmaceutical industries to, isolate and control populations.
Which is a huge claim. And just to be completely clear up front, as we always do on this show, our goal today is just to impartially report and examine the arguments presented in these texts.
Exactly.
We aren't endorsing these viewpoints or taking any political sides here, but we are going to rigorously unpack the data and the logic they use to build this case. Because, if what these sources are arguing is even partially true, it completely rewrites how we understand human suffering right now in 2026.
The stakes really couldn't be higher. We are looking at a rising death toll across the globe. From young children to pensioners, and it doesn't matter what your faith, race, or socioeconomic background is. The texts argue that this epidemic is being completely mishandled because the institutions in charge are just treating the symptoms.
Right, while ignoring or even profiting from the root causes.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you're listening to this right now, maybe you're on your commute or maybe you're folding laundry, and you have ever felt just exhausted by the sheer effort of existing in the modern world, or if you've ever felt ashamed of your own raw moods. This deep dive is going to fundamentally challenge how you view your own mind. We're going to explore why you are not the problem.
Yeah.
But to understand why you aren't the problem, we really have to start by looking at how the system profits from convincing you that you are.
And that brings us directly to the core argument of these texts, which is the weaponization of the mental health industry.
Right. Let's get into that.
The foundational claim here is that the entire modern psychiatric apparatus is basically built on a very specific, very lucrative deception. The texts argue that the industry pathologizes normal human suffering.
I really want to pause and make sure we define that clearly. What does pathologizing normal human suffering actually look like in everyday practice?
Well, it means taking a perfectly natural biological response to distress and relabeling it as a medical disease located inside the individual.
Okay.
Let's say someone is experiencing profound distress. Historically, or just from a purely biological standpoint, that distress is a signal. It's like an alarm bell indicating that something is wrong with their environment.
Like what kind of environment?
Maybe they are grieving a catastrophic loss. Or, maybe they're working 3 jobs and still facing eviction. Or they're trapped in a toxic relationship. The distress is a rational response to an irrational or painful situation.
But the sources argue that the modern medical framework doesn't look at the environment at all.
Precisely. The system isolates the individual. It looks at the person crying over their eviction notice and says, the problem is not that housing is unaffordable and your community support structures have collapsed. Wow. It says the problem is that your brain chemistry is defective. You have major depressive disorder. By locating the disease inside the person, the system effectively absolves the environment, the society, and the government of any responsibility.
That is just a brilliant and frankly infuriating framing. And the texts give some incredible historical context for how this massive expansion of disease actually happened.
Yeah, they really do.
They look specifically at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. For anyone who doesn't know, this is essentially the undisputed Bible of psychiatry. If you get a diagnosis, it comes from this book.
Yes, and the numbers are incredibly telling here. The sources point out that back in 1952, the very first edition of the DSM listed just 106 mental disorders.
Okay, on a 6.
Today, the current DSM contains over 300 distinct disorders.
I mean, just logically, human brains didn't spontaneously mutate over a 70-year period to create 200 brand new ways of malfunctioning.
Right.
That defies everything we know about evolutionary timelines.
It completely does. And the text explain how this manual grew so exponentially. These new behavioral diagnoses weren't discovered under a microscope like some new strain of bacteria.
How are they found then?
They were debated and voted into existence by psychiatric committees in conference rooms. The author Clive Spencer explicitly refers to the DSM in the text as a billing manual disguised as science.
A billing manual. Wow, because you can't bill an insurance company or a state healthcare system for, like, the crushing existential dread of poverty.
Exactly. You cannot prescribe a pill for grief. You cannot bill for a natural human reaction. But the moment you slap a Latin or clinical-sounding label on that suffering,
You've got a product.
yes, the moment you vote to classify it as a distinct medical illness, you open up an entire revenue stream. You can treat it, you can manage it, and most importantly, you can monetize it indefinitely.
And this brings us to the biological justification for all of this, which I think is going to blow a lot of people's minds. Because if we're going to accept that we all have these internal diseases, there has to be a physical mechanism, right?
Yeah, it's the assumption. Yeah.
And for decades, we've all been sold the chemical imbalance theory of depression. I know I grew up hearing this all the time.
Oh, everyone did.
You're depressed because your brain simply isn't producing enough serotonin. It's a hardware issue. But the sources highlight a massive turning point in the actual science.
They do. They point to a landmark umbrella review that was published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry in 2022.
Okay, an umbrella review.
Yeah, and this wasn't a fringe study or some small sample size. An umbrella review looks at all the existing meta-analyses and systematic reviews. It is basically a comprehensive audit of the entire field of study.
The highest level of evidence.
Exactly. And the findings were devastating to the established narrative. The review found absolute no consistent evidence that depression is caused by a serotonin abnormality.
No consistent evidence. After literally 30 years of pharmaceutical commercials telling us that a chemical imbalance is the root of our sadness, that is just staggering.
It is a colossal scientific failure. For 3 decades, the global public was told a very specific story about their brain chemistry.
Right.
And that story was used to justify the prescription of hundreds of millions of doses of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The logic was simple. Your serotonin is low. This pill increases serotonin availability. Therefore, this pill fixes your broken brain.
But the 2022 review revealed that the foundational premise was just flawed.
Completely flawed.
Okay, let me jump in here because this is where my mind immediately goes. If the foundational science is proven wrong on that massive of a scale, you would expect an industry-wide shift in how we treat depression.
You would think so.
You'd expect press conferences, apologies, a total restructuring of psychiatric care. Did any of that actually happen?
According to the texts, the exact opposite happened. The institutional reaction, or rather the total lack of it, is what the sources find so revealing.
Wow.
Despite this massive scientific revelation, the treatment protocols barely shifted at all. The texts point to data showing that antidepressant prescriptions in the UK, for example, actually doubled over a 15-year period.
Doubled.
Yes. We are talking about more than 8 million adults in England alone taking these medications. The scientific narrative was quietly adjusted, but the revenue pipeline remained completely intact.
Clive Spencer describes this in the text as what an institutional lie looks like when it's functioning correctly. The product remains the same, they just, change the marketing copy on the website.
Exactly.
But it leaves us with this massive friction point. If the science on chemical imbalances is so fundamentally flawed, why on earth do we as a society keep accepting these labels?
Because the alternative is looking at the reality of our environment, which is much, much harder to fix.
It feels to me like imagine you're driving down the highway and suddenly your car's check engine light starts flashing red. The car is shuddering. You pull into a mechanic. And the reason the light is on is because you are completely out of oil. The engine is literally grinding itself to dust.
Right.
But instead of giving the car oil, which is what the physical system actually requires to function, the mechanic reaches under the dashboard, snips the wire to the check engine light so it turns off, tells you that your dashboard is fundamentally defective, and then charges you a monthly subscription for the rest of your life for a pill that keeps the light turned off.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
Meanwhile, the engine is still grinding away without oil.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy perfectly encapsulates the core thesis of these sources.
Hmm.
The check engine light is your distress. It's your anxiety, your deep depression.
Yeah.
The oil is what a human being actually needs: secure housing, meaningful community, physical safety, autonomy. By medicalizing the trauma, the system shifts the blame entirely onto your dashboard.
It just lets the institution completely off the hook.
It does. The text provides some very sobering real-world examples of this. Imagine a single mother relying on a sprawling, underfunded state welfare system, working 2 jobs just to afford groceries, raising her children in an apartment riddled with black mold.
God, yeah.
Or consider a traumatized veteran who has been discharged and left to navigate civilian life with zero structural support. Or someone who has just faced total financial ruin due to medical debt. These people are in profound, agonizing distress.
And rightly so. I mean, their distress makes total logical sense given their circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. But when the institutional web hands them a pill and a diagnostic label, when a doctor tells them that their brain chemistry is the primary issue, it completely erases the social and political dimensions of their suffering.
Right.
The economic disparity becomes invisible, the failure of the state welfare system becomes invisible, the institutional abandonment becomes invisible, the patient is the problem, and therefore society does not have to change.
I am genuinely struck by how insidious that is, because it implies that being perfectly well adjusted to a deeply sick and stressful society is somehow the measure of health.
Yes.
But if we are treating this check engine light completely incorrectly, it stands to reason that we must fundamentally misunderstand how the engine actually works. We aren't broken, but something is happening inside us.
Right.
Which leads us directly into one of the most fascinating concepts in this material: the body's operating system, or the BOS.
Yes. If we discard the idea that our brains are just randomly mutating to become defective, we really have to look through a different lens entirely.
Okay, what lens?
The texts introduce an evolutionary biology perspective. They argue that your primitive operating system isn't some glitchy piece of software. It is a highly intelligent, exquisitely calibrated adaptation.
Wow.
Your nervous system was designed over millions of years of brutal evolution to do one thing and one thing only: keep you alive.
Keep you alive in environments where the threats weren't, late credit card payments, but actual predators, where missing a cue meant you were literally someone's lunch.
Exactly. Our ancestors didn't survive by being constantly relaxed and optimistic.
Right.
They survived because their bodies learned to stay hypervigilant, to conserve energy when they were trapped, to avoid physical discomfort, and to instantly prepare for physical combat or flight.
That makes total sense.
These were brilliant life-saving survival strategies. The evolutionary framework presented in the sources redefines almost everything we currently call a psychiatric disorder as one of these intelligent adaptations. They're just being deployed in the wrong context now.
I want to break down some of these specific disorders through this lens because reading this part of the source material completely rewired my brain. Let's start with anxiety.
Okay.
The standard pathology paradigm says anxiety is an illness. It's a chemical misfire causing unnecessary panic. What does the evolutionary paradigm say?
From an evolutionary standpoint, anxiety is a highly calibrated threat detection system. It is your body's radar. In biological terms, we have to look at the cost of errors.
What do you mean by the cost of errors?
Well, a false positive means you feel anxious and run away when there is no actual predator. A false negative means you feel perfectly calm, ignore a rustling bush, and a predator eats you.
Oh, I see. So evolution naturally selects for the false positive. Better to run away from a shadow 100 times than get eaten by a lion once.
Precisely. If someone is experiencing what we label as overactive anxiety, their system isn't broken. It is simply calibrated to assume they are in a highly dangerous environment.
Wow.
Their nervous system is doing its job. It is flooding their body with adrenaline to ensure they survive a threat it perceives as imminent.
Okay, that makes sense for anxiety. It's protective. But what about depression? I really want to push back a little here because it's easy to see how running from a shadow keeps you alive. But how is not being able to get out of bed, feeling completely hopeless, and having zero energy an intelligent evolutionary adaptation? That just seems counterproductive to survival.
It's a very fair question, and the texts address this directly.
Yeah.
The evolutionary framework frames depression as a biological strategy for energy conservation during an inescapable threat.
Inescapable.
Like a trap.
Yes, think of an animal caught in a snare or facing a prolonged, unwinnable winter famine. If that animal keeps fighting, thrashing, and expending massive amounts of energy trying to escape a situation that physically cannot be escaped, it will die of exhaustion or starvation much faster.
Oh, wow.
In that context, the most intelligent biological response is to shut down, withdraw, lower all motivation, conserve every ounce of energy, and just wait it out.
That's incredible.
The hopelessness of depression isn't a disease in this view. It's an accurate biological assessment of circumstances that feel genuinely hopeless.
Right.
If a human being is trapped in a grinding cycle of poverty or trapped in an abusive relationship they cannot afford to leave, their body's operating system reads that as an inescapable threat and triggers the hibernation protocol.
So when we tell people to just push through it or think positive, we are literally fighting millions of years of survival programming that is screaming at them to conserve energy because they are trapped.
Exactly, you're fighting biology.
What about the more severe labels like hypervigilance or dissociation? How do those fit in?
Hypervigilance is constant, exhausting environmental scanning. And again, entirely appropriate if you are in a hostile environment.
Like a war zone.
Like a war zone, or an abusive childhood home where the mood of a parent could turn violent in seconds. Your brain learns that relaxing equals danger.
Right.
And dissociation is the body's absolute last resort survival mechanism.
When the anxiety radar and the depression hibernation don't work.
Yes. When a threat is completely overwhelming and you cannot physically fight and you cannot physically flee, the brain does something incredible. It disconnects your conscious awareness from your physical body.
Just unplugs it.
It cuts the power to the building to prevent a total electrical fire. You detach from reality to survive an experience that would otherwise destroy your psyche. None of these mechanisms are broken. They are the body doing exactly what it must do to keep you breathing.
So, to summarize where we are right now, the system is telling us we're diseased. Evolutionary biology is telling us we are just brilliantly adapted survivors.
Exactly.
The real problem, then, isn't inside us at all. The texts point to what they call the mismatch theory. The issue is that our ancient primitive survival tools are being constantly triggered by modern invisible pressures.
The texts refer to this modern environment as the institutional web. We evolved to deal with acute physical stress. A predator appears, we run, we survive, the stress ends, and our nervous system resets.
Right.
But the institutional web creates chronic, abstract stress.
Because we aren't running from a bear. We are running from inflation. We are running from a toxic boss. We are running from the constant 204/7 psychological bombardment of social media algorithms that are basically designed to make us angry and fearful.
Exactly.
And you can't punch inflation. You can't outrun an algorithm. So the stress cycle never completes.
That is the crux of the mismatch. The texts explicitly note that the biggest causes of mental fitness deterioration are not chemical. They are situational.
Like what?
The top three triggers are money, relationships, and change. Human biology evolved to thrive in stable, predictable, tight-knit tribal environments. Modern life provides the exact opposite.
Yeah, profound economic instability, isolation, constant change.
And yet, despite this massive environmental shift, no one is taught how to operate their own nervous system to handle this specific type of modern stress.
We are just handed the keys to this incredibly powerful biological machine with absolutely no instruction manual.
Right.
Which brings us to a major paradigm shift the author Clive Spencer is pushing for in these sources. He argues that we need to entirely discard the phrase mental health and replace it with mental fitness.
Yes, that's a key point.
And I really want to dig into the semantics here, because words obviously shape our reality. Why is mental health such a problematic term according to the texts?
Words matter immensely, especially when they dictate how institutions treat individuals. The text argues that mental health implies a binary state. You are either healthy or you are diseased. It implies a static condition.
Like a light switch. You have depression or you don't.
Yes. And furthermore, the phrase places the entire problem inside one single organ, the brain, and conceptually severs the mind from the rest of the physical body.
Oh, I see.
It requires a licensed professional to diagnose it, a professional to treat it, and historically the concept of mental health has been used to label and control populations who simply don't conform to societal norms.
Whereas mental fitness, how does the text define that differently?
Mental fitness implies a dynamic capacity that absolutely anyone can develop, regardless of their starting point. It's a direction of travel.
A direction of travel. I like that.
You aren't fit or unfit as a permanent medical diagnosis. You're just at a certain level of conditioning. It addresses the whole biological system.
Yeah.
Your gut microbiome, your cortisol levels, your sleep, your environment. It connects your physical blood panels directly to your lived emotional experience.
It puts the individual back in the driver's seat. Mental fitness belongs to you. It's an active daily practice, much like physical fitness. You can't just weaponize mental fitness to lock someone in a ward.
Exactly. It decentralizes the power from the institution back to the individual.
Okay, so if we understand our basic biology now that our operating system is just desperately trying to keep us alive through these intense, mismatched modern stressors, it naturally leads us to look at how we actually react when that biology is threatened. We all know the classic trauma responses: fight, flight, and freeze. But the sources reveal a fourth response, and honestly, reading about this was the most confronting part of the material for me.
It is for a lot of people.
Because this fourth response is incredibly destructive, and yet society actually trains us and enthusiastically rewards us for using it. We need to talk about fawn.
Yes, the fawn response is absolutely critical to understanding the modern epidemic of exhaustion and resentment. Let's define it clearly.
Please do.
Fawning is the appeasement response. It is a biological survival strategy that attempts to manage a threat through preemptive compliance.
Preemptive compliance.
You neutralize the perceived source of danger by abandoning your own needs and molding yourself entirely to what the threat wants.
It's people-pleasing, but not as a polite social grace. It's people-pleasing as a desperate biological survival imperative.
Exactly. And the texts explain the internal mechanics of this. It's driven by a very specific architecture of fear inside the brain.
How does that work?
Well, the person's memory provides evidence perhaps from a childhood where love was highly conditional or where a parent's anger was dangerous, that relationships are inherently volatile. Their imagination then projects catastrophic consequences if they dare to act authentically.
Wow.
They genuinely fear that if they set a boundary or express anger, it will lead to total rejection, isolation, or abandonment.
So to the primitive brain, being abandoned by the tribe equals death. So you fawn to stay in the tribe.
Yes. The fawn response prioritizes managing that imagined catastrophe over expressing the true self. The true self is suppressed to keep the peace.
But wait, let me push back a bit because I can hear listeners thinking this. Isn't some level of people-pleasing just, necessary for a functioning society?
That's a common question.
I mean, we can't all just be walking around expressing our raw, unfiltered anger every time someone cuts us off in traffic or a boss asks us to stay late. Politeness is the glue of civilization, isn't it?
That is a very important distinction to make. There is a vast difference between conscious politeness and biological fawning.
Okay, what's the difference?
Conscious politeness is a choice made from the wise mind, which we will discuss later. You choose to be polite because you value harmony, but you retain your core identity and you absolutely can say no if a boundary is severely crossed.
Right.
Fawning is an unconscious, autonomic nervous system override.
Yeah.
You do not feel you have a choice. The body perceives setting a boundary as a literal life or death risk.
And the tragedy of this, as the sources point out, is that we are actively conditioning this trauma response into our children on a massive scale.
We really are.
The majority of the global population is explicitly taught to be carers at their own expense. We are taught from a very young age that it is inherently selfish to put ourselves first. We are told to stop crying, to hide our anger, to be a good boy or be a sweet girl, and just keep the peace.
We've engineered a society where everyone is putting everyone and everything else first.
Yeah.
And the biological cost of that chronic fawning is devastating.
Yeah.
What is truly insidious about the fawn response is the contradiction in how the external world treats it versus what is happening inside the physical body.
Right, because society loves a fawner.
Society enthusiastically rewards fawning. The person who constantly subjugates their own needs, who takes on extra work, who never complains, who manages everyone else's emotional state, that person is constantly praised.
Oh, you're so kind. You're such a team player.
Exactly. They receive constant external validation and little dopamine hits of social approval.
But inside their body, what is physically happening when you suppress your authentic reaction to please someone else for years on end?
Inside the body, it is a war zone. The texts outline the physiological toll. Chronic self-suppression means you are constantly holding back your natural impulses.
Which takes energy.
Immense physiological effort, which leads to a massive accumulation of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Your body is essentially redlining all day. Furthermore, oxytocin, the hormone responsible for genuine, restorative human connection, is completely suppressed.
Wait, why is oxytocin suppressed if they are constantly interacting with people and helping them?
Because they aren't actually connecting. They are performing. The genuine connection is replaced by an exhausting, highly managed performance of connection.
That is heartbreaking.
It is. The fawner knows, deep down, that the people around them don't love them. They love the mask they're wearing. Over years of never practicing being their authentic selves, never allowing their actual moods to exist in the world, their literal sense of identity begins to erode. They forget who they actually are.
There is a specific coaching insight detailed in the text that stopped me in my tracks. They describe asking clients a very simple question. Who is the most important relationship in your life?
Mhm.
And the vast majority of people get the answer entirely wrong. They immediately say their spouse, their children, their aging parents. But the text uses this brilliant analogy of the midwife's advice to a new mother.
It's a profound analogy. A good midwife will tell an exhausted new mother that she absolutely must look after herself first. She must eat, she must sleep.
Right.
Because if she completely depletes herself, if she collapses from exhaustion, she physically cannot be there for the baby.
It's the classic airplane safety briefing. Put your own oxygen mask on before assisting others. But applied to our entire psychological existence, if you do not prioritize your own mental fitness, you have nothing of substance to offer anyone else.
Exactly.
But this raises a huge practical question for me. If society is constantly throwing dopamine at you, telling you how wonderful and helpful you are, how do you even realize you are trapped in a biological fawn response?
The realization almost never comes from conscious logical thought, because your logical brain is telling you that you are doing the right thing by being selfless.
So where does the realization come from?
It comes from the body. The sources describe a phenomenon called the life wobble.
The life wobble, what does that feel like?
It starts with profound, unexplainable exhaustion. It's a bone-deep weariness that sleep doesn't fix because it's not physical fatigue. It's the energetic cost of wearing the mask. Then, you might feel a creeping sense of resentment toward the people you're actually helping. You start feeling a persistent, quiet dread that the life you are living isn't actually yours.
Like you're trapped in your own life.
Exactly. You find yourself smiling and saying, "I'm great," when friends ask how you are, while internally, you feel like the walls are caving in. The wobble is the moment the internal biological cost of self-abandonment becomes heavier than the external fear of rejection.
And that realization is terrifying because it means you have to change, which perfectly transitions us into the darkest but arguably most important segment of this deep dive.
It's a heavy section, yes.
Because the exhaustion of constant fawning creates a literal pressure cooker inside the human body. You are taking all these raw, authentic emotions, anger, frustration, sadness, and you are forcibly pushing them underground. I want to ask you to map this out for the listener. Walk us through this emotional pipeline from suppressed emotion to absolute crisis.
The sources map this pipeline out very clearly, specifically referring to frameworks they call the Feeling Dictionary and the Emotion Code.
Okay, what are those?
These are systems for understanding how abstract emotions translate into physiological states.
Huh.
Let's start at the beginning of the pipeline, with anger.
Right. And society tells us anger is bad. Anger is a moral failing.
But biologically and psychologically, the texts argue that anger is a perfectly natural, profoundly healthy response. Anger is the biological reaction to a boundary violation.
Okay.
It is your primitive operating system generating energy so you can protect yourself. It is a signal that something in your environment is unjust or harmful.
So someone takes credit for your work or a partner crosses a line and your body generates anger to give you the fuel to say stop. But because we are trapped in the fawn response, we don't express it.
Exactly. We have been conditioned to believe that expressing raw anger will result in abandonment. So we depress it. We swallow it. We force that highly energized state back down into our nervous system.
But the energy doesn't just vanish, right?
As the texts emphatically note, unprocessed physiological energy does not just magically disappear.
It has to go somewhere.
It does. Hidden, unprocessed anger ferments. It stagnates inside the body and turns into resentment.
The texts dive into the emotion code chart here, which links specific suppressed emotions to physical organs. It connects resentment to the liver and gallbladder.
Yes.
And it defines resentment not just as a fleeting thought, but as a deep physical feeling of displeasure towards someone regarded as the cause of injury. It's the bitterness of being treated unfairly and a rigid unwillingness to forgive.
And if that resentment is left to fester, if the person continues to fawn and suppress, that energy transforms again. The pressure cooker builds and builds.
Until what?
Eventually, the valves of the body's operating system cannot contain the pressure. This is where the pipeline leads to extreme states. The energy forces its way out in ways the individual can no longer control.
We are talking about explosive states.
Yes, sudden, terrifying episodes of rage that seem completely out of character, or dramatic swings in behavior that a psychiatrist might rapidly label as a bipolar disorder.
Or they just collapse entirely.
Exactly. If the system's energy completely collapses inward, it leads to a descent into deep catatonic depression. The original emotion, the healthy anger, was denied a natural exit, so it eventually blew the structural integrity of the operating system.
And the emotional reality of living inside that blown-out system is brutal. The texts refer to this state as the wordless wound.
That's right.
People in this stage feel a profound sense of embarrassment. They feel ashamed, weak, like absolute failures. And because of the societal demand for the fawn response, they feel completely, utterly alone.
They look around and see everyone else seemingly wearing their fawn masks flawlessly. They assume they are the only ones suffering from these raw, ugly, uncontrollable moods.
But the reality is that humans are incredibly resilient creatures. Our biology is entirely geared towards survival. So when a person is living with this internal agony, this worthless wound, how do they survive the day-to-day?
The texts explain that to survive an unbearable internal state, the organism develops coping mechanisms. If the internal signals, the grief, the shame, the physical anxiety are too painful to endure, the brain seeks an immediate state alteration.
State alteration, meaning they will do anything to change how they feel in that exact second.
Precisely. They might need to feel numb because the pain is too loud. They might need to feel wired because the depression is too heavy. They seek out anything that provides a rapid interruption of their current reality.
Like what?
This manifests as substance abuse, compulsive overwork, seeking cheap dopamine rushes through endless scrolling or shopping. And most tragically, it manifests as self-harm.
We really need to pause and dig into the self-harm aspect of these sources, because the data provided here is deeply alarming, and the clinical reframing of the behavior is one of the most important takeaways of this entire deep dive.
It absolutely is.
The texts cite the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey in England. They track lifetime non-suicidal self-harm. In 2007, it was at 3.8% of the population. By 2014, it was 6.4%. And in the 2023-2024 reporting, it had skyrocketed to 10.3%.
That is more than 1 in 10 people. It is an absolute epidemic of internal agony. And the data shows that cutting was the most reported method, at nearly 73%.
But the way the clinical and public spheres often talk about this is what the sources attack so vehemently. The dominant societal narrative is that self-harm is manipulative or that it is attention-seeking.
And the trauma-informed stance presented in the sources completely eviscerates that narrative. Is a critical paradigm shift.
How do they reframe it?
The framework here assumes that an individual engaging in self-harm is doing their absolute best to survive a total biological alarm state using the extremely limited tools they have. They are not being dramatic. They are trying to survive a phenomenon the text calls pattern surge.
Pattern surge, like an overwhelming, paralyzing flood of emotional pain.
Yes. When pattern surge hits, the internal pain is so abstract, so chaotic, and so intolerable that the individual reaches for anything that can override it. Self-harm provides a rapid physical interruption.
Wow.
The sharp, acute physical pain forces the brain to release a flood of endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, which instantly alters their chemical state. It overrides the chaotic emotional pain with a localized, manageable physical sensation.
It is a desperate act of self-regulation.
Exactly. The text frames self-harm as a profound communication of distress. It is a final resort for an internal system that has tried to communicate its pain in a dozen other ways, only to be repeatedly ignored or shamed by the external environment.
So when words fail, when fawning fails, the physical wound becomes the only language the system will respond to.
Right.
That is deeply tragic. And if that communication is also ignored or punished by the system, it leads to the ultimate cost. The texts highlight the rising death toll from suicide across all demographics in 2026. From teenagers to pensioners, people are simply finding themselves trapped in what the text calls the I can't loop. The survival loop just runs out of options.
The progression towards suicide is analyzed with immense care in these sources, and the most confronting part of their analysis is the argument that this progression is not an irrational act of a diseased brain.
What is it then?
It is the grim, logical conclusion of a nervous system that has learned, through repeated, reinforced real-world experience, that reaching out for help produces more harm than staying silent.
I think we need to look at the case studies provided in the text to really ground this because they are heartbreaking examples of exactly how the systemic abandonment happens. Let's look at the case of Frankie.
Frankie's case perfectly illustrates the failure of the institutional web. According to the text, she carried significant childhood trauma, which was compounded by severe adult trauma, including family separation and the devastating loss of her son.
Right.
Because of these events, her nervous system was naturally running on chronic high alert.
Her anxiety radar was pinging constantly, which, as we established, makes biological sense given her trauma.
Yes. But when she interacted with mental health and social services, the very institutions designed to help her, she experienced mistreatment and invalidation. Her system became highly sensitized to the threat of authority figures.
Oh, no.
These were people who promised safety, but delivered control and harm. Consequently, the actual professionals designated to care for her became her primary biological triggers.
So when she interacted with them, her primitive operating system perceived a lethal threat. How did she react?
She reacted out of sheer, overwhelming distress. She utilized extreme methods of state alteration, overdosing on prescribed medications or swallowing batteries. Again, attempting to produce a physical sensation intense enough to override her unbearable emotional pain and trauma.
And how did the institution respond to a woman in that much pain?
The system did not recognize her actions as a desperate survival response to their own systemic neglect. Instead, a social worker labeled her with Munchausen syndrome.
You're kidding.
No. A psychiatric label implying she was fabricating her illness for attention.
They pathologized her reaction to their own failure. They drove her to a crisis point and then blamed her for bleeding.
Exactly. And the sources point to the same grim pattern in the case of Charlotte.
What happened to Charlotte?
She faced decades of whistleblower persecution in her workplace, followed by total abandonment by military and state healthcare structures. She was diagnosed with complex PTSD. But rather than providing the immense structural support she needed, she was deemed too complex to treat.
Too complex to treat. Unbelievable.
She was effectively abandoned by the system, and tragically, she was eventually murdered.
The texts synthesize these tragedies into a framework they call the 6-stage institutional criminalization process. Can you briefly walk us through those stages?
Yes, it begins with stage 1, institutional failure. The system fails to provide basic safety or support.
Okay.
This leads to stage 2, a natural human response. The individual reacts to this failure with distress, anger, or breakdown. Stage 3 is pathologization. The system slaps a medical label on the individual's reaction, turning them into a patient.
Then they use the label against them.
Right. Stage 4 is system justification. The system uses that medical label to justify its previous failures. Stage 5 is escalating control, using the diagnosis to strip the individual of their autonomy. And finally, stage 6, criminalization or elimination. The individual is locked away, abandoned, or driven to suicide.
It is an institutional web that traps people in a web of their own trauma. Okay, we have laid out an incredibly grim, heavy reality over the last chunk of time.
We really have.
The institutional web is exploiting our conditioned trauma responses. The constant fawning is killing our authenticity. The suppressed anger is fermenting into resentment and blowing up our operating systems. And the very institutions meant to catch us are abandoning us when we break. So what is the way out? If you are listening to this and recognizing yourself in the fawn response or recognizing your own exhaustion and resentment, how do you break free? I want to shift our focus entirely to the solutions offered in the text. How do we reclaim our operating system and build true mental fitness?
The texts are not just critiques. They provide highly practical frameworks for reclamation. One of the most foundational tools they advocate is drawn from DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy.
Okay, I've heard of DBT.
Specifically, it introduces the concept of the 3 states of mind: the reasonable mind, the emotional mind, and the wise mind.
I really want to unpack these because understanding how to navigate them seems to be the core of mental fitness. Let's create an analogy here. Imagine you are a pilot flying a commercial airliner through a storm. If you are operating purely in the reasonable mind, what does that look like?
The reasonable mind is cool, rational, analytical, and strictly task-focused. It is governed entirely by empirical facts and logic.
Okay.
If you are a pilot flying purely in the reasonable mind, your eyes are locked dead on the instrument panel. You're calculating wind speed, fuel consumption, and altitude algorithms. But you are completely ignoring your physical senses.
So you're blind to the actual feeling of the plane.
Right. You might be mathematically correct, but if the instruments are slightly miscalibrated and you ignore the physical sensation of the plane dropping out of the sky, You will crash. You lack intuition.
Right. It's too rigid. On the flip side, what is the emotional mind?
The emotional mind is hot, mood-dependent, reactive, and impulsive. It is driven entirely by internal sensations.
So the opposite problem.
Exactly. If that same pilot is flying purely in the emotional line during a storm, they ignore the instruments completely. They feel a sudden, terrifying drop, they panic, and they jerk the steering yoke based purely on their fear of the turbulence. They overcorrect, stall the plane, and crash. Their feelings entirely override the structural realities of the aircraft.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal, the wise mind.
The wise mind is the deep integration of both. It represents true balance.
How does the wise mind pilot handle the storm?
The wise mind pilot feels the terrifying drop of the plane. They acknowledge the fear, they feel the tactile feedback of the yoke, but they simultaneously check the instrument panel to logically verify their altitude before making a controlled, deliberate adjustment. It is about honoring your intuition and responding to the facts.
Mental fitness is essentially the active daily practice of spending more time in the wise mind. You don't suppress the emotion, but you don't let it fly the plane by itself either.
That's a great way to put it.
But to get to that wise mind, the texts argue we have to break what they call the loop of suffering. And they make a really sharp, profound distinction between pain and suffering. Can you explain that mechanism?
This is perhaps the most crucial psychological concept in the entire stack of sources. Pain is an inevitable physical or emotional sensation. It is simply a biological fact of existing.
Right.
If you burn your hand on a stove, the nerves transmit pain. If you lose a job you loved, your body produces the physical sensation of grief. That is pain.
Yeah.
You cannot avoid it. Suffering, on the other hand, is the story we actively tell ourselves about the pain. It is our psychological resistance to reality.
Let me make sure I'm getting this. So my chest hurts because I got dumped is pain.
Yes.
My chest hurts. I am going to die alone. No one will ever love me. The universe is punishing me for being ugly is suffering.
Exactly. Pain is biological. Suffering is cognitive. Suffering is optional. It is the resistance to what is happening. The texts advocate for building a rigorous somatic awareness, which means learning to recognize the raw physical signals in your body before the brain weaves a catastrophic story around them.
And once you feel those raw signals, what do you do? Because the texts outline something called a trigger override protocol.
Yes. The trigger override protocol is the mechanical application of the wise mind. When an alarm goes off in your body, let's say a boss sends a vague, ominous email, and your anxiety spikes. Your conditioned instinct is to react automatically. You want to fawn, apologize, or flee.
Yeah, that panic reaction.
The protocol requires you to insert a pause between the biological stimulus and your behavioral response.
Ugh.
You move into an evaluation and choice stage.
You take a breath, you look at the instrument panel.
You ask yourself, what is the actual fact here? The fact is an email. The pain is a spike in my heart rate. What is the suffering? The suffering is my story that I'm about to be fired and homeless. You interrogate the resistance. By doing this, you step out of the primitive survival loop of I have to and the depressive impossibility loop of I can't. You reclaim your agency.
I love this. It's like realizing you have been driving your car in first gear on the highway for 20 years. The engine has been screaming, RPMs in the red, because someone a long time ago told you that shifting into the other gears was selfish.
Yes, perfect analogy.
You've just been grinding your own engine down to appease the passengers. Mental fitness is finally learning that you have an entire gearbox, you can shift gears, you can cruise, you can set boundaries.
What is truly fascinating here, and what brings this entire deep dive full circle, is the broader societal implication of making that shift.
How so?
Reclaiming your mental fitness, breaking out of the fawn response, and learning to regulate your own nervous system isn't just a personal wellness journey. According to the cultural critique in these texts, it is fundamentally an act of rebellion.
An act of rebellion against the institutional web.
Absolutely. Think about the mechanics of this system we outlined at the beginning of the hour. The trillion-dollar psychiatric and pharmaceutical industries, the sprawling corporate structures, the political fear-mongering, they all fundamentally rely on a population that is compliant, perpetually overwhelmed, and completely disconnected from their own internal authority.
A population that fawns and suppresses its anger is a population that is incredibly easy to control.
Precisely. The text explicitly states that massive institutions are not invested in your recovery. They are invested in your dependency. But a society filled with emotionally intelligent, self-regulated, mentally fit individuals, people who can operate in their wise mind.
They become a threat to the system.
That population becomes fundamentally uncontrollable by fear. They won't buy the unnecessary products sold to soothe their anxieties. They won't accept toxic, exploitative workplace conditions because their fawn response is turned off. They will be easily divided by algorithmic media because they can separate biological arousal from logical fact.
That is incredibly empowering. It shifts the entire framework from victimhood to active resistance. So to recap the massive, heavy, but ultimately hopeful journey we've been on for this deep dive.
Yeah, let's pull it all together.
If you take nothing else away from this, take this. You are not broken. You do not have a defective brain. You are simply a biological organism overwhelmed by a modern system that is wildly mismatched to your evolutionary programming.
Exactly right.
The phrase mental health has been hijacked to pathologize your perfectly normal survival responses, your anxiety, your exhaustion, your grief. Also that a trillion-dollar industry can manage your symptoms while ignoring the root causes of your distress. Your body's operating system is brilliant, but we have been conditioned since childhood to suppress it, to fawn, and to swallow our rightful anger just to please others. And that suppression is literally destroying our bodies from the inside out.
And the path out is the daily, rigorous practice of mental fitness. It is recognizing that prioritizing yourself, setting firm boundaries, feeling your pain without writing a story of suffering, and expressing your raw emotions is not a moral failure. It is the very definition of a healthy, functioning human operating system.
We've spent this deep dive learning exactly how society conditions us to suppress our true selves just to fit into the modern world. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Consider this. If the normal modern world is essentially a giant stress generation machine, a system designed to keep you exhausted, fawning, broke, and dependent on their labels and their pills, what if the absolute healthiest, most vital thing your mind and body can possibly do is to actively, deliberately refuse to fit in?
That's a powerful question.
Your mental fitness belongs to you. No institution can give it to you, and no institution can take it away. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.